Hello, and welcome back to Greek Speaks. This week we are talking about Hades, one of my favorites. I did try to get my sister to get in on this podcast because Hades is her favorite, but it didn't work out, unfortunately. So, he is the son of Kronos and Rhea. He is one of the ones that Kronos swallowed. That's always a great myth to start off things with. He is the husband of Persephone, and if you go back to my Demeter episode, I will explain the story of Persephone. Long story short, Zeus gave Persephone to Hades as his bride. Demeter didn't like this and caused the world to fall into a famine. And eventually Zeus is like, hey, we need your daughter back so you can, let things grow. Zeus sends Hermes down to the Underworld to get Persephone back, and she has already eaten food of the Underworld, which is bad, because she can't leave. And so the solution is have half of the year with her mom, half the year with her husband. So if you want a more in-depth analysis / view of that, go to my Demeter episode. He is the god of the underworld and wealth. Wealth is more associated with his Roman form of Pluto, but it was still a Greek connotation. The idea was that because he was a chthonic god and the god of the earth, he had control over metals and stuff, which were used as currency. One big thing about Hades, he is the king of the dead. He is not the god of the dead. He is not death itself. He's just the king of it. Death itself is an entirely different god named Thanatos. And the idea is that Hades is the grim reality of death in the ancient world. Because you can die a lot in the ancient world just like you can die a lot today. One of his most important cult titles is Polydegmon, which translates to the receiver of many. He also has Polyxenos, which is Xenos is that guest friendship idea that the Greeks had, and so his name Polyxenos is he who has many guests, pretty much. Part of the reason we don't get a lot of shrines to Hades and a lot of interaction with Hades isn't because he's associated with the dead, it's because sacrifices and giving things to the gods is transactional. So if you're sacrificing to Zeus, you're wanting, hey, I'll give you this cow in exchange you'll make it rain next week or something like that. Since Hades doesn't have control over the dead, doesn't control when death happens, doesn't really have anything to do with the dead other than the underworld, he doesn't stop it, he doesn't postpone it, he doesn't do anything. He doesn't get sacrifices because it's not transactional. The three gods that are associated with death itself, in that famous Death of Sarpedon vase, Google Death of Sarpedon, you'll get it. The three gods helping with the death of Sarpedon are Hermes, Hypnos, and Thanatos. We'll get to Hermes a little bit later, but Hypnos and Thanatos are sleep and death, respectively. So those three are the ones that are helping with that. He is loosely connected to the cult at Eleusis from his connection with Demeter and Persephone, but Demeter and Persephone are the two that are worshipped. So death in the ancient world is complicated, just like it is today. The main idea was you wanted to get the dead out of the world of living, which is where the underworld comes in. Because if the dead are running around, they're ghosts, and they're angry, and they're vengeful, and it's bad for everybody. To the point where, Greeks had, laws that are hey, you bury your dead, you pay a tax. That is how big a deal it was. Cremation and inhumation kind of waned and waxed with popularity in the ancient world. Cremation is what happens in, the Iliad and the Odyssey. I believe Troy burns all their dead, and I know Achilles' partner, Patroclus, I know his funeral is a cremation. But we have, and that would have been Mycenae in Greece, but we have inhumation from that time period, and inhumation is just the proper word of burying physically the body. We do have a pretty big inhumation site at a town called Lefkandi in the Dark Ages, and it was a warrior and some type of woman connected to him, and 2 horses. So that's not necessarily the biggest. It's definitely the biggest, person that was buried in that way, it's the biggest source of information we have on that. That's a better way to put it. But other people were buried that way, and if you look at any pot that was made later in Greece or in the Mycenaean period or wherever, you can see burial shrouds and funeral processions and stuff like that. So gravestones, especially in the classical period, were super important because A, they were a sign of wealth. B, there was this idea that you could speak to the dead through the grave, which is super interesting. Cemeteries are outside the walls of the city, so the dead cannot A, either reappear, or B, cannot spread disease and all that fun stuff. So Hades is the god of the underworld, and there are 5 levels of the underworld. We'll go from the bottom up. Tartarus is pretty famous. It's been conflated with the Christian idea of hell. It is where monsters and everyone who is an enemy of the gods go. So Titans, stuff like that. Kronos and a bunch of other people are down there. 3 pretty famous ones that are in Tartarus because they betrayed the gods were Sisyphus, who escaped death, and then once Hades figured out he escaped death, Hades yoinked him down to the underworld and made him push a boulder up the side of a hill for all eternity. Tydeus, he tried to rape Leto, and so he's getting punished in the underworld. And Ixion also tried to rape Hera, and so he is strapped. He's naked, strapped to a flaming wheel for the rest of eternity. Good creativity, I guess. The next layer up is the Fields of Punishment, and that's just kind of like you were a bad person, but you didn't totally offend the gods. There's a great passage in Percy Jackson where Percy sees the Fields of Punishment, and one of the punishment is like getting boiled alive, quote unquote, alive in acid for the rest of eternity while like listening to Dean Martin or something like that. When Percy is thinking about murdering his stepfather, which is warranted. Just trust me on that if you haven't read the books, which you should. I think at one point he's like, "Do I have the authority to send somebody to a place where they're going to be boiled in fondue for the rest of eternity?" Just people like that are terrible people, but didn't offend the gods too badly. Fields of Asphodel, they are pretty much the biggest section of the underworld in most iterations. It's kind of just for people who weren't terrible, but also weren't good enough to have the best punish, or the best reward. It's kind of like Limbo in Dante's Inferno, just a little bit. The other way that it's described is just a huge field with trees and springs, and it's nice, but it's just kind of a giant wheat field in Kansas for all eternity. The next layer up is Islam, and that's just the Greek equivalent of hell, or not hell, heaven, and it's nice. It's pretty. It's a good part of the underworld. The best part of the underworld is the Isles of the Blessed. This is not in every iteration, but it's in iterations that I like. Not that I don't like other iterations, but in some instances there is Isle of the Blessed, a place you get to go where if you have lived 3 times and each time achieved Elysium, that's when you get to go there. Heroes get to go to the underworld, but they don't just like show up and it's just like, yo, Hades, what up? They have a purpose of going down there. Famous ones are Hercules, Odysseus, Aeneas, Orpheus. Hercules, of course, has to capture Cerberus. Odysseus and Aeneas have to talk to some prophet that's dead. His name is Tiresias. No. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Prophet Tiresias who's dead. And Orpheus famously wants to go get his wife and then looks behind him and he doesn't get his wife. What's really interesting is in the Odyssey, Odysseus goes down to the underworld. And Achilles is a nobody. I mean, he's with Patroclus. He's happy, quote unquote, but he is nobody in their underworld, which is cool because it's like, oh yay, more the grim reality of mortality. There are 5 rivers of Hades. The Styx is probably the most famous for if you bathe in it, you become invincible, and then which is proven by Achilles. And also, if you drink the water of the leaf, or not the leaf, drink the water of the Styx, you become immortal. So, we don't have any record of that in mythology, which is interesting. So, we have the Styx, we have the leaf, which is the river of forgetfulness. This is used in Dante's Paradiso. It's one of the Dantes. It just makes you forget stuff. It's pretty self-explanatory. The Acheron, which is the river of pain. Phlegion, which is the river of fire. It's just on fire. It's great. And then the Cocytus? Cocytus. I'm going to say Cocytus, but they're all translated from Greek. Lord knows if I'm saying it right. And it is the river of wailing. So a lot of very happy rivers that you want to have picked by. But People actually competed to see if to be able to say they had the origin of the river Styx. I don't know if anybody claimed the other four, but the Styx is like the one that goes around Hades and is the most famous. So, and that's all in every single myth that I read about Hades. So that is Hades. As always, leave comments if you want me to look at a specific myth in general. We still have an Instagram at Greek Speaks. Have a nice week.